What happens to thought when its own foundations collapse? And is that collapse a catastrophe? Or is it the only honest starting point? The Acid Horizon Research Commons is officially presenting its first course in its spring series. The course is titled Ontogenesis is Impossible: Anarchic Origins in Science, Life, and Art, taught by Timothy N.W. Jackson. You may have heard Timothy on previous episodes of Left Hand. We're thrilled to welcome him to our platform for what is our first dedicated philosophy of science offering. Timothy is a chemical ecologist and a pharmacologist at the University of Melbourne, where he also co-heads the Australian Venom Research Unit, bringing a rare and rigorous scientific practice to bear on some of the most generative questions in contemporary philosophy. You can look forward to him coming on the show in a few weeks. But if you're looking to expand your own conceptual toolkit and bring together your interests in the figures and topics we cover on this show, Bataille, Simondon, Sherman, and others, with serious philosophical approaches to science, this is one course you don't want to miss. And this engagement spans 5 full weeks, meaning students receive an additional week of intensive work at the accessible prices we're committed to offering for these exclusive encounters with friends and fellow scholars of the podcast. Also, if you're already a patron of Acid Horizon, be sure to take advantage of the deep discounts available on the AHRC course archive, which features courses by Emma Stamm, Grafton Tanner, and our very own Adam C. Jones. Your contributions to the archive are helping us realize the vision of building AHRC into a robust para-academic institution, one that also provides scholarships to current and future students. Head to acidhorizonresearchcommons.com for more details on applying for a scholarship and on how you can contribute as a patron to the ongoing growth of this endeavor. All of the relevant links are in the show notes. Today on the show, we're joined by Pete Wolfendale to discuss his latest, The Revenge of Reason, confronting the question that haunts our present moment. What is the fate of reason in the 21st century? And can it be mobilized against not only disinformation and neuroactive media, but also the unearned authority of self-appointed secular priests of rationality and rationalism who exploit its name? Okay, let's listen.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. So today we're going to be asking about, is reason rational? Is reason itself reasonable? And how do we think about reason philosophically beyond simply retreating back to, say, the Enlightenment rationalisms of Spinoza, Leibniz, or using reason as a kind of general buzzword for whatever our intuitions are at the time? The terms logic, facts, and reason have had quite a bad reputation, not only in the post-structuralist milieu, but also in the days of the current days of the media ecosystem. But what if reason will have its own revenge, insofar as we must indeed make the arguments and to reconsider our entitlements in terms of what we can reason against, what we can reason for, and how discourse and justification plays itself out in our discourses of philosophy. And today I'm glad to be joined by Pete Wolfendale, author of The Revenge of Reason, amongst many others, is out now on Urbanomic. We're going to be talking about Neo-Rationalism. I'm, of course, going to ask Pete way too many questions about Hegel because Craig's not here to stop me. And Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm very glad to be here. Let's see what we can say about reason.
So, when most people think about reason in philosophy, they think of a specific method that is rationalism, this idea of deducing everything from sort of pure inferences or pure logic, people like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, who I mentioned at the beginning. What do you think our sort of contemporary philosophical discussions get wrong about rationalism? And where does the work of philosophers such as yourself, people like Ray Brassier, aim to try and sort of reinforce a sort of a new version of rationalism, a neo-rationalism, as you call it, against sort of dominant critiques of rationalism? For example, where you talk about rejecting the idea that reason is itself rational.
Well, I said reasonable. So first of all, there's rationalism and then there's rationalism. So as you've already pointed out, like there's classical rationalism of like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. And this is in some ways taken up by sort of Kant and Hegel and certain other thinkers. There's what is often just called rationalism online these days, which is sort of very much inspired by sort of AHRC and the sort of the less wrong community, also kind of bleeds into effective altruism and all that sort of stuff. Although it uses the same term, it has a different kind of ideological pedigree, which kind of sort of combines basically sort of neoclassical economics, decision theory, certain bits of cognitive psychology, and really the sort of debunking spirit of someone like James Randi. Like that kind of rationalism. I have significant critiques of that thing that gets called rationalism now, which we could get into. It's perhaps best to start with like, well, okay, well, but what was going on with classical rationalism and what's wrong with it? So what I take to be kind of virtuous about classical rationalism is this willingness to pursue inference to counterintuitive conclusions. Right? Take the argument as far as it might go, potentially beyond the bounds of experience in this Kantian. And that is this leads to metaphysical enthusiasm and ends up requiring a kind of the Kantian critique. But I think the key point is reason can have counterintuitive conclusions, right? What's wrong with classical rationalism, I think, is sort of twofold. One is that the conception of reason, so reason becomes this sort of, well, it can be treated as sui generis in a way that tends towards constituting its own form of intuition. So rational intuition is actually a term that gets deployed by some thinkers. And you can see this kind of obviously in Descartes, where like clear and distinct perception is the sort of, it's like, look, I can just clearly distinctly perceive that my mind can be separated from my body, therefore, right? And I think, and we'll get onto Hegel later, but I think ultimately Hegel falls into this category as well, as much as I think he has a very subtle conception of reason, right? Ultimately, he does think there is such a thing as like pure dialectic, right? You just think the movement of the concept and it will just unfurl itself before you. And I think that's fundamentally questionable, right? So one hand, rational intuition, got to get rid of that. On the other hand, there's also and this is kind of related insofar as what's going on in that kind of pure rational intuition is the kind of complete separation of reasoning from the process that instantiates it, right? Be it understood like mathematically as like, here are the series of inferences that are being used to construct this proof, or in the sense of like, well, look, here are the underlying cognitive systems, right, that are processing the information that's getting you to this conclusion, right? And this is most obvious in Descartes, and like the ego as a kind of like immaterial substance, but you see it elsewhere. So I think the first thing that really sort of distinguishes what I can call the sort of neo-rationalist program is the emphasis upon the realization of reason within actual processes within the world. I think this has always been a part of Ray's work in his sort of confrontation with neuroscience and cognitive science. He's always been really emphatic about needing to take the sort of empirical study of the mind seriously. And mine and Rez's work, I think there's more an emphasis on computer science and the ways in which we can talk about the realization of reason and cognitive processes at a kind of level of maximal abstraction. We can maybe talk a bit more about that.
Well, yeah, actually, can I ask you something about abstraction, actually? Because I think one of our last episodes, we had a panel on digital theory. And one of the things that really caught me was they was talking about abstraction and the sort of going against sort of critique of abstraction that often appears, in which abstraction is fundamentally considered as a subtraction or a reduction in this kind of sort of Derridian sort of way. And I guess when we're thinking about reason and we're thinking about maximal abstraction, is this abstraction, for example, if we're talking about computation and sort of we're framing sort of the human mind in computational terms, not necessarily to the most strong extent, because I know, for example, in Island Brown, Ray Brassier criticizes like the Churchlands for a kind of computational idealism in which everything is just magically structured like the computational sort of software sort of process. When we're talking about computation here, the idea of a kind of maximal abstraction, I think a lot of listeners will probably just have the idea of, is it the reduction to the computer in this idea of, so there were the early cyberneticists were constantly talking about essentially turning the human brain or the human nervous system into essentially a flowchart. And this, my inner Adam Curtis comes out and I'm like, this mystical sense certainty exceeding of all of these concepts. How does approaching the computation abstraction this way sort of avoid or sort of actually, where do you think sort of critiques abstraction may miss the mark here? What's sort of the case for abstraction?
So, first of all, I like the way in which the notion of abstraction, like, rather than talking in like the Marxist discourse of abstraction, I'd rather talk in like the computer science and software engineering discourse of abstraction, because their abstraction is the opposite of implementation. So, for instance, you might have like, okay, we've got a problem. We want to break down this number into its prime factors. Okay, but there are different ways in which you can do that, right? So you might say, okay, well, we've got different potential algorithms for solving that problem. And even once you've got those different algorithms, then there are different languages within which you could try and write a program that would enact those like abstract algorithms. And then beneath that, you've got different, like, say, if you're using an interpreted language, you've got different interpreters that can interpret the same program, and you've got different hardware that that's going to run on. So you have like a very concrete sense of this hierarchy of abstraction. And at the top, we can say abstract things about the nature of the problem. Like we can put it in a computational complexity class, for instance, right? But that we can move back and forward in this way. So first of all, for me, like I like talking about it as the sense of like functional implementation and abstraction, right? Now, this leads to talking about representational abstraction. So, I mean, I have a piece about all this, by the way, if anyone's interested, called Artificial Bodies and the Promise of Abstraction. So one of the things that I think is very important about language and rationality is the capacity for abstraction. And so the example I like to use of this is, so there's something called Smale's theorem, right? It's a theorem that says it's possible to avert a sphere. What that roughly means is like turning a sphere inside out without creating any creases at any points, right? Now, interestingly, right, this is a theorem that was proved prior to anyone actually figuring out how you could do it. So there was a proof that it was possible, but no one figured out actually what's a process through which you do this. And then a team of mathematicians worked on figuring out like a way that you could actually avert the sphere. One of them, Bernard Morin, is blind. And I think what's fascinating about this fact is, like, what you have is a team of people who have different forms of intuition, right? Who fundamentally, the ways in which their imaginations are grappling with these objects are different, and yet they're able to think about the same thing and talk about the same thing. Again, mathematics is the perfect example because it is the language of abstractions. But I think this operates in kind of everyday intentionality, right? Between you and me, the neurological processes, the specific neural networks, right, that are going to represent any specific thing that we're talking about, going to be different substantially. Like our brains are going to have evolved in slightly different ways. Yet we've somehow been able to calibrate, right, the way in which we represent things linguistically, such that those implementation details don't matter. That moves us from the talk of abstraction implementation into the sense of like abstractions involved in representation. Is this making sense?
Yeah, no, I'm trying not to simply, the difference between abstractions and implementation, I'm trying not to be like, okay, so it's kind of like spirit. I'm kind of thinking, okay, so I'm like, okay, there's an intersubjective framework here, which we can use the mutual language of abstractions as developed historically, even despite our differences. I'm like, okay, fill in the gap, apparently make it easier for me. I'm thinking, okay, spirit, got it. Like, it's a truly continental way of approaching it. Like, okay, it's the magic thing.
We like ultimately, I do think Hegel got a lot of this right. Like when I'm talking about like our neurological representations have been synced up somehow. The story of that syncing up is a story of mutual recognition and institutions generated out of it. Right? Like we could talk more about it, but like there really is like useful ways of mapping Hegel onto this stuff. And indeed he thought about a lot of this already. Did I sufficiently answer the question?
Oh no, that was great. I mean, it's actually, I think, just drawing on what's talking about sort of the collective process and the Hegelian process. I mean, one of my sort of, I sort of fled analytic philosophy from my initial training in it towards Hegelianism, but when I come back is in the analytic reading, and that is one analytic reading, which is John McDowell, and his reading of the master-servant dialectic is essentially the unity of the empirical self, listeners, so the sort of the subject of feels, and then the formal condition of the subject as that which, basically, in order for any experience to be an experience, it has to be had by a subject. But there's also a different thing in experience, which is the actual feeling of self itself. And McDowell says that Hegel unifies this in spirit. So basically what he does is he unifies sort of the point of abstraction and the point of empirical, sort of the abstract and empirical sources of knowledge. That's a very rough overview, just because I don't want to assume everyone has read this one John McDowell paper. But I wanted to ask sort of how computation brings into this idea of these two different sources of knowledge, say sort of the more abstract or the transcendental, or you can probably say the mathematical in this case, and the empirical as two different sources of knowledge. How does computation function in your conception of the rational, such that we can talk, despite our fact we might have different empirical selves, different empirical histories, different empirical intuitions?
So crucially, like the big claim I've been making for like about 10 years, and at least it's in print now, is that like what Kant is doing in the project of transcendental psychology is essentially the program of artificial intelligence, right? It's trying to give you a maximally abstract conception of what something has to be able to do to be a mind. And you can read this in information processing terms. Like whenever Kant talks about representations, just think information. And there are different kinds of representation, different information, different faculties and functions for processing and whatnot. That's a big claim. But I think if you break down Kant, a lot of this makes a lot of sense. So the initial point I'll make to make sense of this, and then I'll get into the actual question, is like if you look at the problem of machine vision, right? It's been a huge problem in artificial intelligence for decades, right? Like how do you get a system to take unstructured visual data and then return judgments about the world on the basis of that data? Like give it photographs and then get it to count how many people are in them, or like describe the scenario that's going on. Like this is two people playing tennis. That's an incredibly hard problem. Kant understands that. Like Kant's the first person to go, the world is not given to us as individuated objects, right? This is for me, the real import of the Copernican turn is like, look, objects aren't given to us as individuated. We have to do this work of turning unstructured data into objects that we can then make judgments about that potentially true or false. That's objective validity. Okay, how does this work? Well, there's a distinction in Kant between the mathematical and the empirical, or what he more often calls the pure and the empirical. And this operates at the level of both sensibility and understanding. Importantly, within the imagination, right? So you have this notion of pure and empirical schema. Right, it's like a pure the example which he has vanishingly few examples, by the way. But like the one example that's very constant is he'll say like, look, there's like the schema of a circle, which is something like a rule for drawing a circle within intuition, for generating a circle within the imagination. And we get pure mathematical knowledge out of our ability to do constructions, like Euclidean constructions within the imagination. An empirical schema is something like the schema of plate, where you can look around in your kitchen and you can see something, and you synthesize the intuitions you're getting, so that even when someone picks it up and you see it from different angles over the time, like you see that's the same plate. And Kant's interesting point is that one is parasitic upon the other. The schema of plate depends upon the schema of circle, because plates are circular, at least if you're not at a super fancy restaurant. Now, this sort of relationship between sort of like abstract mathematical structures and the concepts that correspond to them, and empirical, or I would say rather than empirical structures, I'd say empirical behaviors, the way in which intuition sort of dynamically behaves. And when we say intuition, crucially, one thing I would emphasize, because I think people don't emphasize this enough, is Kant is thinking about this in interactive terms. So it's not just like me sitting and looking at the plate, but it's also me interacting with the plate, picking it up and turning it around, right? It's not just observation, but also manipulation. Right. But again, like, so those interactive behaviors can, to some extent, be understood via mathematical categories. Interestingly, if anyone's done any object-oriented programming, I know me talking about object orientation is like whole kind of worms. But in object-oriented programming, you have you construct like an object of a plate, and then you can give it like attributes. But these attributes will be like abstract. They'll be typed with like abstract data types. So like it might be like, what's the size of the plate? Well, that's a floating point number, which we're going to interpret in. So like, and you could theoretically have the same thing for like geometric attributes, right? So actually, there's this distinction between like an empirical concept and underlying like mathematical structure that's inherent within processing information about it is actually quite de rigueur in certain parts of computer science. Okay, so this is Kant's sort of model, roughly, like. Yeah, so we've got this like stream of information. We somehow like unify it, bundle it, and then stamp it with a concept, and that tells us how to use that information in drawing inferences. So that, like, I can tell you, I've got some. Let's think of a silly example, like some Charles and Diana plates at home, and you don't have to see them. You can just infer various things about them and me from the fact that I have those. Probably going too silly with the examples here, but right, okay. So Kant has this distinction between pure and empirical, and it runs through cognition, and it's this important kind of dependence of the empirical upon the mathematical. Where I think Kant goes wrong is, where does he go right? So Kant has this notion of transcendental logic, and as opposed to general logic. And transcendental logic is logic as if individuation mattered. And what we mean by that is, like, it's the logic of synthesized objects that we can then say things that are potentially true of, rather than a logic in which we could be talking about like absolutely anything, like unicorns or whatever. It's logic that's connected to those things that we've painstakingly put together out of sensory data. But that logic in Kant is the same between mathematical and empirical objects, right? So when we're talking about the isosceles triangle, and when we're talking about the Bermuda Triangle, right? Like it's the same logic in either case. And I think that this is a kind of fundamental error on his part, that actually the logic of the mathematical and the logic of the empirical actually break apart, because the way in which mathematical objects are individuated and the way in which empirical objects are individuated are fundamentally different. And I think the way in which to kind of pursue this, right, is to go sort of deeper into the relationship between logic and computer science, because there is a very rich connection between logic and computer science that's kind of evolved over the last 100 years or so. I could talk about that more.
Well, yeah. So in terms of their breaking apart, in terms of mathematical or pure logic being able to go beyond the bounds of the empirical, yeah, this is Kant's main thing. He says you can't do, or it says you can do it, but the representation will never correspond to anything. And if it seems like that, you've got what Kant calls a transcendental illusion, where you sort of, it's like for listeners. So take the example of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Therefore, just purely by thinking about it, I have posited that there's a thinking substance out there, and I am at least one of them. Kant's going to say that yes, you can represent that in your mind. It's thinkable, it's intelligible, but it doesn't correspond to any object. And if you think this representation is an object, it's completely illusory, because in order for something to be an object, it's got to be fundamental, it's got to be sensible. It can appear to you in space and time. Now, those are so tightly bound that nothing, we can't really talk of anything in terms of an object that isn't reducible to the empirical. In terms of the mathematical or the pure abstract splitting off from the empirical, does this mean that we could, by thinking in terms of computational science, we could think of an object that isn't just tied to sensibility and have representation that could create it? Or is that something that you're trying to avoid? Because I know you earlier was talking about getting rid of sort of the rational intuitions. Now, is that the same as what Kant would call intellectual intuition? So for listeners, Kant has this distinction between empirical intuition, which is, as you're saying, Pete, it's all about interaction. It's about being affected by something outside of us. But intellectual intuition is original. It's when the intellect sort of creates its own objects and actually has them. Like, does computation bring back intellectual intuition? I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing if it does, but
I would say absolutely not. Like, so the key point is, and this gets back to this connection between logic and computer science quite neatly, is that essentially what's going on in Kant's philosophy is that mathematics is apinned to construction within imagination, right? But you can lose the within imagination part, or rather, so like a better way to think about it is like in Kant, we understand what mathematical construction is in terms of imagination. But I think actually what's happened over the last 100 years is we've gained the resources to invert that and say, actually, no, we can understand construction independently and use that as a basis for understanding what imagination is. So to trace that through a little bit more concretely, like, so you get mathematical intuitionism, starting with Brewer, right? Which is this kind of like, okay, mathematics can only really deal with things that are constructible. And it's initially very much like things we can imagine. But when you move into Hegel and you get intuitionistic logic, this has got nothing specifically to do with perception of any kind. It's just, look, if we're doing mathematics constructively, we can't have excluded middle, and we can't have double negation and stuff like this. Now, what happens over the course of the 20th century is that people realize there's an intrinsic relation between this like intuitionistic constructive conception of logic, this like what you call like proof relevance within logic, and computation as like the mathematization of like reasoning and information processing, right? And this kind of becomes concrete in what's called the Curry-Howard correspondence. This is the idea that like you can treat proofs as propositions. To be a bit more specific, you treat types as propositions, right? And you take instances of types as a proof of a proposition. And this becomes like the fully worked out logic when you say things like, okay, well, a proof of the proposition if P then Q is a function that takes a proof of P and turns it into a proof of Q, right? This gets generalized into a much more abstract take on type theory. And if you look at, there's a philosopher whose work I think is really important called Per Martin-Löf, who's more famous in computer science because he developed something called Martin-Löf type theory, which is the extension of this into dependent types. Anyway, this then develops into, much more recently, this idea of homotopy type theory, which is something like a natural theory of mathematical types, or if you want to be more Kantian, natural theory of mathematical concepts, in relation to the programs through which instances of those things are constructed in such a way that you can prove things about them. So we get towards like an abstract theory of the mathematical intuition, mathematical imagination, as it's realized by any possible sort of computational system. And that's my sort of thing, is invert this sort of thing going on in Kant, and if you trace it through the history, you get towards the promise of a computational theory of the imagination. What's tricky is that what works for the mathematical does not necessarily work for the empirical, or rather, if we can use this mathematical program as a guide, we've got to recognize that there's a fundamental kind of duality between the mathematical and the empirical. So when we're dealing with, like, again, like circles or vector spaces or whichever mathematical type you want to look at, and we're dealing with like instances of those things, we're talking about construction, right, within like either imagination or within like the RAM on my computer, right? When we're talking about empirical objects like the Charles and Diana plate or the car driving by outside my window, these things aren't constructed, they're interacted with. And construction and interaction are fundamentally dual notions. And that leads to an important logical differences that I will admit I've got intuitions about, but I don't yet have like a full like worked out program for. I can talk about it more, but that's the basic approach.
That split at the very least requires us to engage in the process of reasoning rather than being too confined within the conservatism of someone like Kant, who just works backwards from what he thinks, what sciences he's already got, and then at one point in rejoinder to Fichte, he's like, well, these are eternal, unfixed, completely fixed. They're epigenetic, but they don't have a history actually. Epigenesis just happens all sort of simultaneously. He never answers it. But in terms of the rational, in a way, sort of, I wouldn't say, not say exceeding the real, but exceeding the empirical. I don't want to reduce the real to the.
One thing I would say is just to be a bit more concrete about the mathematics, right? Like the important thing is we can prove things about mathematical objects we cannot visualize, right? Like, and we are getting to the point at which we're going to be able, through like AI assisted proofs, like prove things about mathematical objects through concrete constructed processes like that we can trace and validate, but which just are not intuitive to us in any meaningful sense of the word. And that doesn't mean they're like transcendent or belong to intellectual intuition. The processes are concrete, and we can validate every step.
I can't help but think that with I can't. I had the thought come into my head that, okay, mathematically, we will reach the RK fossil. So it's not an object of intellectual intuition. That it's not transcendent. And I'm thinking, what's the kind of thing I could imagine that we might use this to dig up? And they're like, yeah, RK fossil. That's something for the quantum measure people in the audience. If hopefully people are still reading Artifinity. I mean, they should like translate his book on the non-existence of God at this point. But
it's the only good thing in Harman's Meyesu book is there are excerpts of An Existence Divine, and they're absolutely beautiful. Like they're like I have a friend who is like, he said he was like weeping reading them, and again, like they're completely false. Like he's obviously wrong, but the ambition is like it's like someone tried to do like a clean room reconstruction of Christian theology. Like someone like I've never read any Christian theology before, and then just like recreate it from scratch.
He is very. I mean, I remember the first time I read After Finitude, and it was the effect it had on me was sort of like the first time you read the ontological argument, when you're like, oh, thank God, no. Okay, never mind, it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's wrong. Yeah. Okay, thank God, this could have had some real implications. but that's the kind of the attitude of Meyesu's approach, which is, it does have that kind of Kantian Enlightenment theory of dare to be wise. And I do want to ask about the link between rationalism and Prometheanism, this idea that we can't really be doomers about this, or fundamentally the only way we can think about a political truth or a political aspect of freedom as anything true in the world is to believe in our ability and our power to, at least at some point, construct it. I wanted to ask, what do you think the link is between Prometheanism and rationalism? Because I know one of the essays in this book deals with kind of reading sort of rationalist elements in the Promethean sense into aspects of things like left accelerationism and xenofeminism, which I found interesting because, other accelerationisms, their authors will not be named, it do have this kind of Kantian conservatism to them where it's just the machine goes burr and we should all just feel lovely about that. It's easy to do that, of course, when you're telling the people who own machines exactly what they want to hear. Which is that's fascinating. That truly a great and underrated thinker for our times. But in terms of people who actually say things that are true, how do we talk about Prometheanism in relation to rationalism, and why does your vision of neo-rationalism imply a kind of Prometheanism about the prospects for human freedom as realizable in history?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. I mean, to start with, I think there's a sort of implication in the opposite direction. So I think Prometheanism entails, right, like if you want to be a Promethean, I think you have to be a rationalist, right? And to give the definitions I use in the essay, I say like rationalism is the rejection of like predetermined limits upon thought and self-understanding, right? And Prometheanism is the rejection of predetermined limits on action and self-transformation. And my claim is, look, if you want to reject predetermined limits on action and self-transformation, you have to reject predetermined limits on thought and self-understanding. There's no way to be a kind of like a sort of principled like correlationist skeptic, to invoke Meyesu again, and also to be like a full-blooded Promethean, right? At least that's my claim. Now, how do things go in the opposite direction? Like, how do I think the sort of neo-rationalist picture that I put together motivates taking up a Promethean perspective? I mean, one thing to say before I get any deeper in is that, like, at least in that essay in the book, like, I take egalitarianism for granted. Like, I take basically, like, if you're left wing, you've got to be sort of Promethean, right? Like, which of course means those who are not named can, we're not left wing, fine. I do think you can motivate egalitarianism from a kind of rationalist perspective. I think this is basically what Kant and the Kantian tradition following him have been trying to do for a couple of 100 years, in the sense of like trying to say, look, when we occupy an impersonal position of reason, right, what that gives us is a certain sort of rational symmetry between ourselves and others. Like anything that I take to be a good reason motivating my action, I have to allow is a good reason motivating your action, all else being equal. How you do that, it tricky. Like the original position has had the tires kicked on it quite a bit and doesn't quite work. But I do think there is a kind of strong Enlightenment sort of position of, look, if you're trying to get down to the bottom of things and reason from first principles, you just have to be an egalitarian. I think you could throw in Mark Fisher's cold rationalism in there as well. I think there's a certain connection to the impersonal character of reason there too. So you can be a Spinozist about it as well. How does my specific take on reason tend towards Prometheanism? Now, so I've already mentioned one duality within Kant, which is this duality between the mathematical and the empirical. I think the other key duality in Kant is that between the theoretical and the practical. Something that articulates the whole sort of project. And this, crucially, is the relation between reason and freedom, right? Which then gets developed further by Hegel and others. I have this particular take. I think if there's one thought that's original to me, that's in the book, it's that what you might call general intelligence, right? If you're in the artificial intelligence field, I sometimes call it wisdom elsewhere, is dual to practical autonomy. So understanding general intelligence helps us understand what autonomy is. And my key point about general intelligence is that actually it involves this kind of open-ended ability to learn. And that open-ended ability to learn involves a certain capacity for revision, right? So you have to be able to not just acquire new information additively, but also integrate that new information, right, into a consistent and coherent picture on the world in a way that might force you to revise your understanding of aspects of that world. So another way to put it is, it's not just about revising your beliefs, which is what the left-wrong rationalists focus on, through like Bayesian inference. It's also about revising your concepts, right? So the key example I always use is like when Einstein moves us from Newtonian physics to kind of like general relativity, our conception of space changes, right? Okay, so the key point for general intelligence is, at the very least within the empirical space, all of our empirical beliefs and concepts have to be open to revision, right? No, there can't be any one that's held like foundational or fixed. So this is a kind of coherentism. What's the correlate of that within the practical realm? That would be to say that any of our desires, principles, motivations, values have to be potentially open to revision. So, and this is my picture of what it is to be an autonomous agent. It's to set one's own goals in the sense that none of the stuff you start with is fundamentally fixed. The process through which you go through life and the conflicts you encounter between the multiplicity of impulses driving you, right, and the actual material world you can engage with, forces you to change and evolve, right, in ways that are potentially unpredictable. So that's my picture of sort of like individual autonomy. It's this like practical revision. And crucially, I think selfhood is the thing that enables this kind of revision. Like, and this I'm kind of with Heidegger. It's like Heidegger essentially says that like what structures Dasein or whatever is kind of the question of who it is. Like at the end of the day, we can always ask, who are we? That's where all our questions about what we're doing bottom out. And another way to tie that up is to say it's kind of like open-ended reflection on our goals. So just like we have open-ended learning on the one hand in the theoretical sphere, we have open-ended reflection in the practical sphere. Now, that's just at the individual level, but I think this applies to the collective level as well.
Yes, I mean, because I think regarding this idea of being open to revising your concepts, this is one that I think one of the issues of Kant, that he does not give us this ability. Now, we can revise our sort of levels of respect for what we ought to do, such we feel more inclined to go with it as opposed to sort of sensuous inclinations. But for Kant, the theoretical or the practical, one starts only at the limit of the other, and we have these fundamental moral concepts, but they are fundamentally unrevisable. It's just a matter of adequating them, and that's why he has to give us this rational religion in which we believe, for listeners who don't know Kant's second critique in this regard. Basically, our infinite task is to improve ourselves so that we can better do what we already know we should do, and that's why you have to believe in God, the future life, and an immortality of the soul. Not because it's speculatively true, but because morality would. You wouldn't be able to fulfill your obligations, which would bind you anyway, without these postulates. Ought implies can. If you can't do it, then you don't ought to do it. So the ought gives us a hell of a lot there. But in terms of this idea of revising our concepts, indeed revising it, that injects a bit of his historical here. Yeah. And of course, the first person to have introduced the historical into this was ultimately Hegel. And I know you describe yourself as a minimal Hegelian, and not only Hegel gives you this idea of history, but he also gives you this more direct way of translating freedom into the world, or indeed the idea of translating reason into the world. So I just wanted to ask, I know we have got a few amount of time, but I just want to ask what it means to approach Hegelianism in regards to reason as kind of an extension of what you've been talking about in terms of Kantianism.
Yeah. So this is naturally where we go. Here. So I would want to make one point, which I think, so of course, concepts are definitely revisable in Kant, at least empirical concepts are, right? But Kant has this distinction between concepts and ideas, right? And ideas are what are operative in the practical domain. And crucially, ideas are problems or questions, right? That are in some sense like unanswerable, like they're not definitively answerable. So they kind of guide the process of inquiry and understanding. I think Kant essentially has the right idea there. I mean, yeah, there's the pun. But fundamentally, it's the person who really fleshes out this kind of problematic character of the idea, right? That develops the dialectic, right? Okay, so where do we go with Hegel? So first of all, Hegelian minimalism. As I said earlier, I think basically the logic doesn't work, right? And I think this to some extent is freeing, right? Like there isn't such a thing as this just like pure dialectic where you just think the concept and it will just necessarily self-transform itself into these. So this isn't to say I don't think there's no good reasoning in Hegel, but I think the good reasoning, the parts of the different dialectics and the different main books that we find compelling, we can take out and we can reconstruct and appropriate in the ways we like. But the way in which he thinks about this sort of conceptual self-transformation is still extremely subtle and nuanced. And it can be applied more generally for thinking about the ways in which conceptual revision occurs. And in particular, the connection between conceptual revision and sociality. And sociality thought first in a very abstract way, just as this kind of like dialogical interaction between me and you, I and thou, and then the way in which that kind of like abstract social interaction has to be concretized and transformed into like communities and institutions and things like that. So on the one hand, basically, like I think as a minimal Hegelian, you take like, okay, there's something about the structure of the concept and this idea. I mean, the way I like to put it quite flippantly is like Hegel shows us that there are some questions we can ask where we can get answers that tell us to ask better questions. And that's this kind of like ongoing process that Kant was kind of hitting at with the ideas, right? And on the other hand, like the Hegelian account of mutual recognition, right? And the way in which that ties into freedom is also extraordinarily subtle. And we can take that without having to then think that like the sovereign control of the state is like the end point of history, right? Or even that like the state has to be treated as being like conceptually more important than the individuals composing it because it's this kind of like realization of the dialectical movement, right? And so that's the rough like minimalist Hegelian position I lay out. But one final thing, I mean, I think Hegel's definition of freedom in the philosophy of right, so he has a very like small definition of it, which is freedom is being with oneself in another. And I think that's, I mean, it seems maddeningly concise, but if you understand it, I do actually think it's incredibly significant, right? Because it's basically the core of Hegel's idea that freedom is about self-realization. Freedom. So this is what differentiates Hegel from someone like Spinoza, where like freedom isn't simply being what one already is, even at like a maximal level of intensity, right, or self-expression, right? It's about what one is being kind of confronted and engaged with the world in such a way that it changes and modifies.
No, yeah, and in terms of the development of this, because I know in your essay on Hegel in the book, you focus on what I'd call Hegel's middle system, I guess, because it's back in the time around sort of 1806, 1812 or so that he was producing these books, The Phenomenology of Spirit and The Science of Logic, as meant presumably two parts of the same system. Not presumably, he wrote a fucking advertisement saying, this is part one, this is part two. If you folks have ever read the Cambridge edition of The Phenomenology of Spirit, you can see his advertisement for it. And it really does promise a lot. And I really hope it didn't deliver, otherwise there's some very unsavory conclusions. But in terms of the way in which the science of logic sets itself up, it's justified, it's founded on this idea that in the phenomenology of spirit, what Hegel says is that why don't we just start from the most basic form of consciousness and let it ask its own questions from the most simple versions, and then in asking those questions, it will learn to ask better questions. And then fundamentally, it will learn more about itself. It's almost like extracting the right question out of itself. And then so when you get the right question, which is at the same time its own answer, because you're just asking what the best question is, you have absolute knowing. And that's where Hegel says, okay, good. You've learned how to ask the right question, and luckily it's its own answer. And that comes up in the sequel, The Science of Logic. Now, in how Hegel, and I know I've very much reduced Hegel's argument here, you say that this is the greatest mistake in all of philosophy. The justification of the logic. So I'm reducing it generally, but it's mostly.
Well, I would say the logic itself is like probably the greatest mistake. Like I'd rather say the whole Hegelian system is the greatest mistake. It's like, because it is like, regardless of what you think, you've got to be fucking impressed, right? Like people who aren't impressed by Hegel haven't spent a lot of time reading Hegel. And I have various complaints, but like you can never like dint the man's ambition and the sheer amount of talent like put towards it. My beef is, so I really like the way in which you frame the phenomenology as just like asking questions, and the questions keep transforming themselves until you get to absolute knowing. But what goes on in Get You Absolute Knowing is you find out that questions are actually not what you should be doing. You shouldn't be asking, like, what is being? Or like, what is freedom? Or what is this? No. You think being directly, and you watch how being transforms itself within and again, Hegel would say this isn't an intuitive space, but basically any Hegelians you talk to, like, okay, what are you thinking when you're thinking being, turning into nothing, turning into becoming, and so on? There's inevitably this kind of like intuitive gymnastics involved. Yeah, my problem is that I think this non-discursive, non-interrogative form of thinking is fundamentally illegitimate. It gets back to that kind of Cartesian clear and distinct perception. I just clearly and distinctly perceive that like reflection turns into, I'm trying to remember the actual order of categories now. I wanted a better example than just being and becoming, that diversity turns into opposition.
Being turns into nothing, turns into becoming, turns into unity, turns into quality, turns into continuum, turns into the one and the many, and turns into quantity, turns into ratio.
But the thing is if you doubt any of those transitions, I mean, Hegelians have written some really interesting elaborations and interpretations of what's going on. But like at the end of the day, you reach a point where they're just like, just think harder. You're just not being imminent enough to the concept, right? You're allowing other stuff to come in and cloud your judgment. Just heave to the concept. And I think that's illegitimate, right? And it's illegitimate because it needs to be justified by the logic, by the phenomenology. And I think the justification doesn't work. And if I can elaborate why.
Oh yeah, please do.
So basically, I think Hegel's definition of natural consciousness is beautiful, right? But you've got to understand what it's a response to. So Hegel's responding to Pyrrhonian skepticism. So the Pyrrhonian skeptics give this like very basic definition of what like discursive argumentation is. And then they show like, look, for the only ways you can justify anything are either by appealing to itself, or by appealing to something else, or by going in a circle, right? And whenever you end up at the thing that you're using to justify this thing, the same applies, right? So you end up with this like horrible regress, right? What Hegel does to respond to this is essentially to go, you're giving an inadequate account of the appearance of knowledge. He's not assuming that knowledge is possible. He's saying, look, the appearance of knowledge within ordinary discourse is more complicated. And he gives this like still beautifully concise account of it, which is consciousness relates itself to an object, right? So we believe a proposition about an object, right? But it also distinguishes its belief from the object. So the proposition and the object are different. And crucially, what this means is the proposition can be false, right? Like we can be wrong in claiming something about an object, right? And this is objective validity in Kant's terms, right? Now, Hegel then draws out the implications of this, which is that, look, in order, right, to distinguish itself from the object, distinguish the believing from the object, consciousness has to have a concept of its object. And another way to think about this is just, you have to have a concept to individuate what it is you're talking about or inquiring into. So in order for us to have like a meaningful disagreement about something, be it Hegel or think of another example like black holes, there has to be this concept that we've got which is picking out what we're talking about. And Hegel, the sort of final point is, but consciousness has to suppress the difference between the concept and the object in order for that possibility of error to hold, in order for us to keep that distinction between the proposition and the object, we have to kind of forget that the concept is ours. So we have to kind of suppress the fact that like we're the ones who've defined what it is we're talking about. So and another way to put that is we don't acknowledge that the concept can be wrong, right? In order for the beliefs involved in the concept to potentially be wrong, we just have to forget that the concept is something that itself can be assessed as being right or wrong. And I think this is just like crystal, absolutely beautiful, perfect description of the structure of ordinary discourse and inquiry, right? The structure of like discursive intentionality, let's call it that. Hegel then says, okay, I'm going to give you the simplest form of this, which is like sense certainty, like I think this, and then I'm going to show you how every possible form of that self-contradicts until you exhaust that concept, this immediacy, right? And then it becomes perception. And then you go through every possible form of perception and so on 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 until all possible forms of natural consciousness are exhausted. And what we end up at is the opposite of natural consciousness, which is not the separation of subject and object, but their identity. Right? And which then is just, you just think being immediately. My objection to this is that, well, best put in the form of a kind of challenge. So why can't we do to Hegel what Hegel does to the Pyrrhonian skeptics? So Hegel goes, your account of discursive inquiry, your account of the appearance of knowledge isn't sufficient. We've got this stuff that we've got to add in. Why can't we add more into the account of discursive inquiry than Hegel himself allows? And what would be the basis upon which we adjudicate any of that? So the way I like to say it is like, I stick with natural consciousness, right? I think natural consciousness is the correct perspective. It's just, we need to work out natural consciousness more. We need to elaborate the structure of rationality. And again, for me, rationality there is sort of continuous with what we're ordinarily doing, rather than being this special kind of like rational intuition that Hegel ultimately wants to try and justify.
And it's only through the use of the logic that I guess you would say that, because Hegel does think it's all retrospective, that when you find it, it's been what it's always been that. So that's part of the trap of Hegelianism. I mean, I do remember, I've never read this book, but it was called The Owl at Dawn, and there's someone tried to extend the phenomenology. And it's almost like we just keep having to do it. I mean, which Hegel nerd hasn't thought of just putting a couple of volumes at the end of the system? You just put Feuerbach at the end. It's okay, there's anthropology, and then, oh, look, it's Marxism at the end. It's exactly what I was going to posit in the first place. It does get into that kind of buy-in, and I guess one of the problems with Hegelianism as well is there's a fundamental theoretical desire at play that isn't really acknowledged, which is, oh, thank fuck, we can have the absolute, and it's a big enough system that it actually seems like the relatively best bet. And in terms of the description of natural consciousness, I think it's an interesting project to apply sort of a more consummate skepticism to Hegelianism. I mean, you do have that with, I think you do get it a little bit with Gilles Deleuze. To the extent that like one of the things that sort of made me read a lot of Deleuze more, which was Hegel's. I mean, I was going for this reading of Hegel from Stephen Holgate. That it has no presuppositions.
Yeah.
Now, as someone who comes from analytic philosophy, that's a fucking good offer, because you have people arguing all the time about, oh, here's my intuition about this, and I'm biting the bullet on that, and I'm like, okay, can they give me a system which I don't have to consider like someone's free philosophical opinions as magically meaning something? Because that just seems like whoever's richest magically has the most profitable opinions, profitable intuitions. And that's when you kind of get the Hegel buy-in for me of this idea that, oh, it's just doing it itself. It's in a way, although that does end up kind of disavowing the rational part of reason, because you end up feeling like, okay, I was a spirit's moving through me. It's this kind of, I don't know, sort of evangelical, charismatic sort of framing. Or it was that reason the whole time. And so I think I like the idea of minimal Hegelianism, partly because the maximal ones, I mean, we saw the maximal Hegelianisms, and they both fought it out in Stalingrad.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, I've said this a lot recently, that there's like a lot of people would rather pretend Hegel said something other than what he said, rather than Hegel being wrong.
Well, I'm getting a call from Ljubljana right now, and they're quite pissed. Head office is really, really annoyed. I thought Hegel was the exact type of communist I was. I mean, we dealt with this in the 1840s.
Yeah, and I think Hegelianism and Marxism go through phases, but I think we are back in another like Hegel Marx phase, where people are like, if we just read Hegel properly, that will tell us how Marx should be read, and that will give us the exact form of communism. And it takes slightly a few different forms. I am, like, despite being both sympathetic to Hegel and Marx, like extremely unsympathetic to this perspective. We could talk about that in more depth if you like, but
no, absolutely, go for it.
Well, so I mean, these take. So, okay, one thing I will say is I think Marxism is at its strongest when it's kind of an empirical take on history and economics. And so when it's informed by developments since Marx was writing, and is trying to go, okay, well, like how do we we have a progressive research program, right, in which we can make sense of this. And there's plenty of people writing in that sphere and who have written in that sphere over the last 100 odd years who I disagree with, but who I think are like genuinely moving stuff forward. I think it's at its weakest when it retreats to a priorism. And I say this as a guy who really likes a priori, like just like you, like I feel the draw of the presuppositionless, like, position. Like I like transcendental philosophy. I like universal necessary claims when I can get them, right? But I severely doubt my ability to get those kind of claims about like economic trends and the ways in which societies can potentially evolve. Which isn't to say I'm not willing to be surprised, but I find the way in which Marxists often reach for Hegel is a way of bolstering this kind of a prioristic side, so I'm not a big fan of value form theory stuff. Like I mean, again, I haven't engaged with it as much as I should. Like the thing I always want to ask is like, okay, given the value form, why isn't ancient Rome capitalist? And you know, and I just don't think there's a good a prioristic way of differentiating those things. I certainly don't think reading the logic and kind of getting the exact relationship between essence and appearance right is the thing that's going to make that work.
It's funny, honestly. I've written recently some pieces that follow a kind of dialectical logic in the context of Marxist organizing. But the weirdest thing about doing it is I haven't done it in a very typically Hegelian way, which is it's almost like I've seen the dialectic playing out. And I'm like, well, you're not meant to do. The dialectics are meant to be how you revise your own sort of presuppositions and criterions. But then I remember I was looking at sort of an internal sort of latent sort of political, not conflict, but definitely one that's brewing from difference to opposition to contradiction. And I was like, and I was talking to a friend of the show, Billy Cashmore. She's like, yeah, it's just the logic of essence, isn't it? And I was like sitting in the pub, pulling out the logic of essence. I'm like, fuck, okay. I'm doing empirical dialectics, as in we're making the same mistake again.
Yeah. But I don't want to shit on the logic of essence. Like I studied Hegel with Hegel as well, and I did a whole course on the logic of essence, and it's really fascinating, and I really genuinely would like to write something about it at some point. But to give like a different example, there's another sort of contemporary take, I'll just name like Jensen Suther's take on Hegel and Marx, which is. But it's basically like, in order to be a true Marxist, you've got to be Hegelian. And it like gets to the point of like, the real materialism is absolute idealism all along. and in particular because he wants to take the dialectic of life in the logic of the concept and say, oh, like this is how we should understand like this kind of Aristotelian conception of self-actualization, and that should be the heart of kind of the Marxist conception of self-actualization and the deactualization of the proletariat and stuff like this, right? And again, I just think, I'm like, if there's one thing I am 100% balls to the wall for, it is like opposition to normative naturalism. I think like any conception of teleology that you take to be inherent within nature is just like, it doesn't matter what your intentions are, the end of that is reactionary politics, right? Like the end of that is someone saying, oh, well, this is unnatural and you shouldn't do it. So I think grounding your politics within an Aristotelian conception of life is just horrifying. But worse, to be told I have to do that because, like, well, if you go through and you follow the entirety of the logic around about page 500 and such, right, we get the correct account of life. I'm like, I think we can get off the train before that. Like, at the very least, you're going to need to give me an independent justification of this stuff.
Yeah. Then at least we need something like a critique of dialectical reason or something, but one that's not 2 volumes and even more torturous to read than the dialectical reason itself. This is kind of the problem. I mean, I guess that's something to maybe to round things off on then. In terms of rationalism, we've spoken about sort of the forms of construction, the sort of binaries it's intervening on. Where does rationalism stand in relation to one of those sort of fundamental Kantian concepts, that of critique, in terms of the criticism, not simply our own sort of self-criticism and revising our own concepts, but also, let's say, social criticism? Insofar as everything is kind of socially determined, our reasons are discursive, how does a rationalist approach, I mean, I would say most likely because of its Prometheanism, how does that give us or sort of refine or reinforce the idea of criticism as such?
Okay, critique is one of those terms that has an awkward genealogy, and so, but I think there is a coherent genealogy. I think it weirdly kind of ties up interestingly with Hegel's conception of natural consciousness. But let me do a few backflips and we'll see if I can make it work. So Kant's critique of reason, well, is kind of like articulating the transcendental conditions of the possibility of knowledge, right? And thereby like delimiting it, right? Obviously developed through the course of like the 19th and 20th centuries to expand the conception of what those conditions were. Beyond the transcendental into empirical conditions and quasi-transcendental conditions. People disagree about precisely their force, but like of looking at like not just kind of biology, but language and culture. So you might think of like Nietzsche and Foucault and but also like the Marxist tradition, like thinking about say like economic structures and ideology and things like this. There's a characteristic kind of attempt to go, look, these are the things that are conditioning the way in which you are claiming to know or inquiring into X, Y, or Z, right? And if we understand and take apart those conditions, right, what we find out is the underlying knowledge is in some important way distorted. And this can be either like empirical knowledge, but it can also be like thinking about like how life should be lived, or like what makes a good society, or this, that, and the other, right? I think this is kind of related to Hegel's conception of natural consciousness in this point about suppression. Like we have to have concepts to pick out what we're talking about. We have to kind of like ignore that those concepts are themselves things that are open to critique. So for me, the the general understanding of critique is this like taking apart the concepts or whatever other cognitive conditions of enabling us to think and talk about what we're talking about in order to then ultimately at the end of our critical jiggery pokery being able to end that suppression and get back to talking about the thing in a better way. I think where forms of critique have gone wrong, is in the refusal to end the suppression. The refusal to kind of like, so there's a kind of like critical moment of bracketing, right? He's like bringing a Hegelian term. And then there's a point at the end where you end the bracketing and it's like, what have we learned and how do we move back to the object level discussion of how we should live our lives, or what's the correct way to unify quantum gravity, whatever it is the object level thing is. I think in various ways in the 20th century, the critical gesture ended at this kind of like unwillingness to re-engage afterwards, be it theoretically or practically. And I think good examples of this are like Derridean deconstruction, on even more intensely like Laruellian non-philosophy. And what these actually are sort of ways of disidentifying critique with the mode of rationality that's being critiqued. So you're like, oh, I'm not doing philosophy. Like I'm just going to unilaterally like examine your stuff, and we're never going to actually. There's never going to be a reconciliation where we can talk about the thing again. I know that's being a bit cruel to Laruellians, but it's on brand for me. So the key point for me is critique is itself reason. This is like reason reflecting upon itself. And indeed, I think that if you take Kant's understanding of reason, this is totally correct. Because if you look at the faculty of reason in Kant, it's the faculty of the economy of principles. It's the thing that revises the rules of the understanding, because it basically is the thing that takes a strategic approach to theorizing. This is the sense in which Fichte's priority of practice is already implicit within Kant, right? The reason is itself, in some sense, taking a practical approach to inquiry. And this is, again, why the ideas can be this kind of like problems, right? Yeah, where was I going with this? So critique is reason doing its work. Okay, how does that get us to like actual critique of social forms and whatnot? I mean, one thing I would say is this is where you have to kind of like be willing to. So if there's one thing that online rationalists in quotation marks are quite good at, it's the object level. They will just be like, I think we should implement this crazy social policy because of this reasons, right? And it's very easy to go, oh, whoa, right? Like, I think you'll find there's a whole bunch of background assumptions that are shaping your position that you haven't examined here. And if we examine them, we should think about things differently. The trick is not just to end there, but to get back to the object level discussion of like, maybe we shouldn't optimize fish shrimp welfare. Like maybe, but maybe this is the way in which we should think about, shrimp policy or biopolitics or whatever. And this is where like, I think there is a kind of rapprochement between rationalism and empiricism. So if you think reason is about this kind of capacity for revision and rearticulation, you have to kind of go out and confront the empirical state of the world and the ways it's going to tell you that it contradicts your assumptions. Got to go out in search of contradictions. So is this remotely satisfying?
No, this is good. This is a good way to round things off instead of going out and finding contradictions. I mean, And sometimes they come in a sort of comedic historical way. I mean, Nick Bostrom's The Future of Humanity Institute closed down due to unforeseen circumstances, much like the proverbial joke about the medium. And I have not really looked into much of the Eliza Yudkowsky stuff, but I do have a sort of a Thatcherite critique of it, which is the problem with that kind of less wrong rationalism is eventually you just run out of Jeffrey Epstein's money. So on that note, I couldn't help myself. That's not going to be edited out. If not, there's some mythical meme beast AI machine will torch me later, and I will say.
I could put in one more substantive point because I realize I just kind of talked for ages about critique and reason without really saying anything about society. So the other thing that I think's important is, I think if we pursue this kind of trajectory properly, we also critique, crucially, what we take freedom to be. Right? Like this is the ultimate object, right, of critique in this practical sense. It's like, what the fuck is freedom? Do we have any? How do we get any more? And for me, the key sort of pressing critical problem is the way in which liberalism as an ambient political philosophy misunderstands what freedom is. Right? Not just theoretically, but concretely. So that like there's no way of like giving me enough additional choices of like cereal at the supermarket, right, to balance off my inability to kind of like get a house or think long term about like what my life trajectory is. Right. So like, and then we can start getting concrete about like the details of like, well, what are these options exactly, and what are the social features of capitalism that's actually concretely acting as obstacles to the ways in which you and I, as rational beings making decisions all the time, are able to realize our freedom individually and collectively. Right. So it's also about understanding what are the obstacles in the world to rational autonomous agents like ourselves. Right.
That's a good question to leave off with the listeners. Is the revenge of reason also the revenge of freedom? But on that note, I want to say, Pete, thanks so much for joining us on the show today. The book is out now, and yeah, I mean, you can be found at your blog, Deontologistics.
I have a Substack now as well.
There's a mass proliferation of posting technologies, comrades. And yeah, no, thanks for joining, and thanks for listening, folks. We'll see you next time.